By the time Rachel Bennett sat across from the loan officer on a cold November morning, her father had been dead less than a year. The corn harvest had come in far below what she needed, and Bennett Farm was running out of money. She had already cut every expense she could justify, delayed repairs, emptied most of her savings, and worked enough 14-hour days to stop remembering what weekends felt like. None of it changed the number printed at the bottom of the bank statement. Her operating loan was due, and Rachel was short by more than she could earn before the deadline. The loan officer never threatened to take the farm, but he did not have to if Rachel missed the payment. The bank would tighten its control over the property securing the debt, and the next bad month could leave her with choices she no longer controlled. So Rachel made the decision she had sworn she would never make. She sold part of the farm. Not a field, not the farmhouse. She chose the old, corrugated metal tractor shed on the north side, together with the small parcel beneath it. The shed was weathered, cold in winter, and mostly filled with equipment her father had stopped using years earlier. Selling it to neighboring farmer Caleb Turner would give Rachel enough money to meet the immediate obligation and keep the rest of Bennett Farm intact. To Rachel, it was a painful sacrifice. To her family, it was proof she had failed. Her older brother Mark actually laughed when he heard, "First the shed," he told her, "then the fields. You're just selling the farm one piece at a time." Even Rachel's mother quietly asked whether it might be smarter to sell everything while the land still had value. Rachel said nothing. She signed the papers, paid the bank, and tried to convince herself that losing one building was better than losing the entire farm. She had only a few days to clear out the shed before Caleb took possession. On her final afternoon there, Rachel carried out old tools, empty oil containers, rusted parts, and boxes her father had left untouched. Then, behind a wooden cabinet, she noticed something strange mounted to the wall. 17 metal hooks stood in a neat row, each marked with a number. Only 3 still held keys. Rachel had worked around that shed since childhood, but she had never noticed them. Beneath the hooks was a faded metal cabinet. Inside, she found a black notebook in her father's handwriting. The first pages contained names Rachel recognized from farms around Mason Ridge, followed by equipment she knew had never belonged to those people: tiller, post driver, splitter, trailer. Beside each entry were dates and small dollar amounts. Rachel kept turning pages. The same names returned month after month. Then she reached a page where her father had written 2 words across the top in capital letters: Steadyside. Rachel frowned. Her father had always complained that the tractor shed cost more to maintain than it was worth. Yet according to the notebook, money had been moving through that supposedly useless building for years. She took the records back to the farmhouse and compared them with old bank statements. That was when she noticed something she had never understood before. Even during months when Bennett Farm sold no crops and livestock income was thin, small deposits had appeared with remarkable consistency. They matched the dates in her father's notebook. Rachel had just sold the one building everyone considered expendable, only to discover that her father had been using it for something the family knew almost nothing about. And when a young farmer named Eli Warren arrived the next morning asking whether Thomas Bennett's old equipment arrangement was still running, Rachel finally asked the question that would change how she understood both the shed and her father's farm. Eli stared at her in surprise and said, "Rachel, didn't your dad ever tell you this shed paid for itself every year?" What Rachel discovered next would eventually lead her back to the same building she had been forced to sell. But this time, she would return under circumstances nobody in her family expected. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Whether you're starting your morning, working through the afternoon, or listening late at night, I hope you have a peaceful and wonderful day. And if you enjoy emotional stories about family, farming, hardship, and people rebuilding what everyone else thought they had lost, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story. Now, let's return to Mason Ridge, where Rachel was about to learn why 17 numbered hooks in an old tractor shed mattered far more than anyone had imagined. Rachel Bennett knew the meeting was going badly when the loan officer stopped talking about numbers and began talking about options outside his office window. November wind pushed dry leaves across the parking lot in Mason Ridge. Rachel kept both hands around a paper cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. "The operating loan comes due Friday," he said. "Your harvest payment covers most of it, but not all." Rachel looked again at the figure on the statement. She had already calculated it 6 different ways. The corn yield had come in below projections after a difficult growing season, while fertilizer, fuel, and repair costs had climbed. Her savings could cover part of the shortage, but emptying the account still would not close the gap. "If I can't make the full payment," she asked, "we review the loan and the collateral position. I'm not saying the farm disappears Friday, Rachel. I am saying your flexibility gets smaller." That was enough. Bennett Farm had been in her family for generations. Her father, Thomas, had died less than a year earlier, leaving Rachel aging machinery, outstanding debt, and fields she was still learning to manage alone. She had returned from Des Moines during his illness and stayed because selling immediately had felt like abandoning him twice. Now sentiment would not make Friday's payment. By afternoon, Rachel had identified the only asset she could sell quickly without sacrificing productive acreage: the old tractor shed on the north side of the farm and the small parcel beneath it. The corrugated metal building needed roof work and had not housed the main tractor in years. Caleb Turner, who farmed nearby, had previously mentioned wanting storage closer to one of his rented fields. Rachel called him. Caleb walked through the shed that evening, inspected the roof, measured the parcel, and named a fair price. It was enough. Rachel hated that fact. Mark heard before the paperwork was finished. Her older brother arrived at the farmhouse the following morning and found Rachel reviewing the sale agreement at the kitchen table. "You're actually selling it?" "The shed." "Yes, Dad's shed? A building Dad barely used?" Mark laughed without humor. "First the shed, then the fields. You're just selling the farm one piece at a time." Rachel closed the folder. "The money clears the shortage on the operating loan for this year. What happens next year, I'll deal with next year. That's not a plan." Their mother, June, stood at the counter pretending to rearrange cups. Finally, she turned. "Rachel, maybe Mark has a point about looking at the whole picture." Rachel stared at her. "You want me to sell the farm?" "I want you to have choices before the bank makes them for you." June's voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. Rachel looked from her mother to Mark. Neither of them had spent the last months calculating feed costs at midnight or coaxing another season from equipment older than she was. Yet part of her feared they were seeing something she refused to admit. She signed the sale anyway. 2 days later. Caleb owned the tractor shed and its small parcel. Rachel used the proceeds to meet the urgent bank obligation and kept enough aside for the immediate farm bills. The relief lasted less than an hour. That afternoon, she went to clear her remaining belongings from the building before Caleb began using it. The shed smelled of dust, grease, and cold metal. Rachel loaded hand tools, old chains, and several boxes of parts into her pickup. Every object seemed connected to Thomas somehow. He had taught her to sharpen blades at the workbench and had once spent an entire January rebuilding a transmission beneath the weak overhead lights. Selling the building suddenly felt less practical while she stood inside it. Rachel pulled an empty wooden cabinet away from the rear wall to sweep behind it. Something metallic clicked against the paneling. She stopped. Mounted at shoulder height was a narrow board she had never noticed because the cabinet had hidden most of it. 17 small hooks were arranged across the board in 2 neat rows. Each hook had a number painted beneath it, 1 through 17. Only 3 held keys. Rachel touched the first empty hook, then the next. Thomas had been meticulous about tools, but she could not remember any equipment on Bennett Farm that required 17 separate numbered keys. Beneath the board were faint rectangular marks where labels seemed to have been removed. Rachel looked around the nearly empty tractor shed. She had come to clear out the last pieces of a building she no longer owned. Instead, on the wall behind her father's cabinet, she had found evidence that he had been keeping track of something nobody had ever explained to her. Rachel returned to the tractor shed the next morning with a flashlight and the 3 keys she had removed from the numbered hooks. Caleb had told her she could take a few days to finish clearing Thomas's belongings before he moved equipment inside. But Rachel no longer cared about the boxes she had left behind. She wanted to know what the 17 numbers meant, in daylight. The board looked deliberately organized. Each hook had been screwed into place at equal intervals, and Thomas had painted the numbers by hand. The remaining keys hung beneath 4, 9, and 12. Rachel tried them on the padlocks attached to several old metal cabinets, but none fit. Along the opposite wall sat dusty plastic bins filled with spare belts, pins, bolts, and hydraulic fittings. Rachel had intended to throw most of them away. Now she noticed faded strips of masking tape on their lids. One read 4, another 9, a third 12. She opened the number 4 bin and found replacement tines and a folded receipt for a tiller repair. Number 9 contained heavy pins that looked like they belonged to a post driver. Number 12 held wedges and a drive belt. "What were you doing in here?" "Dad," she murmured. She searched the workbench next. Thomas had kept coffee cans full of mismatched hardware, old manuals, pencils worn down to stubs, and receipts for parts dating back years. At the bottom of a dented metal cabinet, Rachel found a black notebook beneath a stack of equipment catalogs. The first pages contained dates and names. Warren Tiller, 2 days. Mills post driver returned. Keen splitter paid. Farther down, Thomas had written small amounts beside several entries. $40, $65, $30. Rachel turned another page. The pattern continued. Equipment went out, returned, sometimes needed a belt or bearing, and money changed hands. Some entries simply said, "No charge helped with fence," or "Trade for welding." Rachel sat on an overturned bucket. She recognized several surnames from farms around Mason Ridge, but the arrangement made little sense. Bennett Farm did not own all the equipment Thomas had listed. At least, Rachel did not think it did. She checked the numbered bins again and realized the numbers were probably tied to individual machines rather than cabinets. The keys had once belonged to equipment stored here. But where were the missing 14? She took the notebook back to the farmhouse and showed June. Her mother adjusted her glasses and flipped through several pages. "Did Dad rent equipment to people?" Rachel asked. June frowned. "He loaned things all the time." "These aren't loans. People paid him. Thomas handled that kind of thing himself." "You never asked your father came home with $50 in his pocket and said somebody borrowed a machine?" "I didn't conduct an audit." Rachel smiled, despite herself. "That sounds like him." June returned the notebook. "Maybe Mark knows." Rachel did not want to give her brother another opportunity to explain the farm to her, so she set the question aside. Before lunch, a pickup she did not recognize pulled into the yard. A young man stepped out and introduced himself as Eli Warren. Rachel immediately remembered the first surname in Thomas's notebook. "I heard about your dad," Eli said. "I'm sorry. I hadn't been by since last year." "Thank you." Eli glanced toward the north side of the farm. I also heard Caleb bought the old shed. Rachel's attention sharpened. He did. So I figured I should ask before spring, are you keeping the equipment arrangement going somewhere else? Rachel stared at him. What arrangement? Eli seemed surprised. Your dad's. What exactly did my father do for you? Mostly rented me equipment I couldn't justify buying. Tiller, post driver, sometimes the trailer. Other people used different stuff. He charged you? Sure. Not much. Enough for maintenance. Rachel went inside and returned with the notebook. Eli recognized it immediately. He pointed to his name. That's me. What were the numbers for? Each machine had a number. Dad kept the keys on hooks. Rachel corrected herself. My dad. Right, sorry. Elle explained that Thomas stored some equipment he owned, and some that belonged to neighbors who let others use it. People called ahead, collected what they needed, and paid small daily fees or occasionally traded work. Thomas kept everything organized from the tractor shed. Rachel looked toward the building she had sold 3 days earlier. How many people used this? I couldn't tell you. More than me. Was it actually worth his time? Eli gave her a puzzled look, as though she had asked whether corn needed rain. Rachel, didn't your dad ever tell you this shed paid for itself every year? After Eli left, Rachel carried Thomas's notebook to the kitchen table and began reading from the first dated page. What had looked like scattered favors now formed a pattern. In March, someone rented the post driver for 3 days. In April, the tiller went to 2 different farms. Summer brought trailer rentals and repair work. Autumn entries included a seed cleaner Rachel vaguely remembered seeing behind the tractor shed years ago. Winter contained fewer rentals, but more notes about bearings, welding, chains, and small engine repairs. None of the payments impressed her individually. $30, $50, $75, occasionally more when a machine stayed out for several days. Yet the entries continued when crop income did not. Near the middle of one notebook, Thomas had drawn a line beneath a monthly total and written 2 words in block letters. Steady side. Rachel frowned and pulled old bank statements from the farm filing cabinet. She compared deposits against the notebook. It took nearly an hour before she saw what Thomas had meant. Bennett Farm's crop income arrived in large, uneven amounts. Equipment money arrived in small pieces throughout the year. A $40 deposit here, $120 there, another $80 the following week. Steady. Rachel whispered. It had never been enough to make Thomas wealthy. It had been enough to keep cash moving. The next afternoon, she met Caleb at the tractor shed. He had arrived to measure shelving but agreed to let her finish sorting Thomas's equipment before he took full possession. Anything that's clearly yours, take it, Caleb said. Anything that belongs to somebody else, we'll figure out who. Together they pulled equipment from the back section Rachel had barely entered since Thomas became ill. A compact tiller sat beneath a tarp. Behind it was a hydraulic post driver. They found a log splitter, a small seed cleaner, and an old utility trailer with newer tires than Rachel expected. Shelves held labeled belts, pens, filters, and fittings. I thought half this stuff was junk, Rachel said. Caleb examined the splitter. Some of it probably is. Helpful? You want comforting or accurate? Despite herself, she smiled. They matched faded numbers on the machines to the hooks. Number 4 belonged to the tiller. 9 matched the post driver. 12 was painted on the splitter frame. The 3 remaining keys suddenly made sense. Other numbers appeared in Thomas's notebook beside equipment no longer in the building. Caleb pointed to one entry. That disc mower belonged to Ray Mills. Thomas kept it here because Ray didn't have covered storage. So Dad was renting other people's equipment sometimes? More like coordinating it. Owner got something. Thomas kept something for repairs and trouble. You knew I knew people borrow things from him. Didn't know his numbers. That distinction mattered. Thomas had not secretly operated a formal business. He had built an arrangement from favors, spare machinery, and trust. Rachel felt both impressed and irritated. Why didn't he ever tell me? Caleb shrugged. Maybe he didn't think it was worth explaining. Rachel looked around the shed she no longer owned. Apparently, I didn't either. Before leaving, she photographed every machine and copied its serial number. At home, she called 2 names from Thomas's notebook. One farmer confirmed that the seed cleaner belonged to Thomas. Another said he had jointly purchased a small auger with him years earlier and had forgotten it was still listed in the shed records. Each conversation revealed the same loose system. Thomas knew who owned what, who needed what, and who could be trusted to return it. Rachel began a spreadsheet because the notebook's shorthand drove her crazy. She listed equipment, ownership, rental amounts, repairs, and annual income. The totals surprised her. The operation had not produced enough to replace a crop, but in Thomas's last healthy year, before illness reduced his work, it had generated several $1,000s after the expenses Rachel could identify. She went deeper into the farm records, matching parts receipts and deposits. Some years were better than others. During difficult harvests, the small income mattered more because it arrived between larger bills. Late that evening, June found Rachel surrounded by papers. "You're still working on that Dad had a side operation? Your father would have called it helping neighbors." He charged them. Thomas believed people respected equipment more when they paid something. Rachel turned the laptop toward her mother. "This wasn't random." June studied the numbers. "No, I suppose it wasn't." Rachel opened the operating loan statements from Thomas's final healthy year. Interest had accumulated month by month. One of those costs that never felt dramatic until it became large. She totaled it, then compared the figure with the net equipment income. Her chest tightened. "Mom?" June leaned closer. What Rachel pointed at the 2 numbers, the difference between them was surprisingly small. The tractor shed operation had earned enough that year to cover nearly all the interest charged on Bennett Farm's operating loan. Rachel sat back, hearing Mark's voice. First the shed, then the fields. She had sold the building because she believed it was the least productive thing she owned. Now she understood Thomas had used that supposedly useless shed to soften exactly the kind of financial pressure that had forced Rachel to sell it. The discovery would have been useful a month earlier. Now the building and the place where Thomas's entire system had operated belonged to Caleb. Rachel spent the next week calling names from Thomas's notebook. Most conversations began with surprise. Some people had assumed the equipment arrangement ended when Thomas became ill. Others thought the machines had been sold. Eli Warren came first, bringing another young farmer named Lucas Keene, whose family had rented Thomas's log splitter for years. A third man, Dale Mills, confirmed that his father had used the post driver every spring. "Buying one never made sense for us." Dale said, "We needed it 3 days a year." Rachel understood immediately. Small farms were surrounded by machines they could not justify owning. Thomas had filled that gap with equipment already sitting idle. Rachel chose 3 machines she still legally owned: the tiller, the log splitter, and a small utility trailer. She moved them into an unused corner of Bennett Farm's machine barn and cleaned the space. Unlike Thomas, she refused to rely on memory. She created a simple sign-out sheet, wrote down deposit amounts, photographed equipment before each rental, and tracked fuel and maintenance costs separately. Her years managing agricultural supplies in Des Moines suddenly felt useful in a way fieldwork never had. Eli rented the tiller for 2 days. Lucas took the splitter the following weekend. Dale reserved the trailer for hauling fencing. The first week brought less than $200. Rachel still felt absurdly pleased when she deposited it. Mark heard about the arrangement from someone in town. He arrived one afternoon while Rachel was checking the splitter for a damaged hydraulic hose. "So this is the new plan?" he asked. "What plan? You lost a building, so now you're running a rental counter out of a barn?" Rachel kept inspecting the hose. "People need equipment. People also need grocery stores. You going to open one of those? Dad made money doing this. Dad also had a farm that was actually working." The comment landed exactly where Mark intended. Rachel straightened. "I paid the bank by selling part of the property, and I'm trying to build another source of income." Mark shook his head. "You're chasing pocket change while the real numbers are in the fields." Pocket change covered most of Dad's loan interest one year. That stopped him briefly. 1 year. It still happened. Mark glanced around the machine barn. Just don't confuse activity with profit. After he left, Rachel hated that his last sentence stayed with her. The next rental proved his point more than she wanted. Dale returned the trailer nearly a day late because his truck broke down. That delayed Lucas, who had planned to use it next. Then the tiller came back with a loose belt and damaged guard. The renter insisted the guard had already been cracked. Rachel had no way to prove otherwise because she had failed to photograph that side before it left. The repair cost consumed almost the entire rental fee. For 2 days, the operation felt less like Thomas's steady side and more like another collection of things waiting to break. Rachel changed the process. Every machine received a numbered checklist. She photographed each side at pickup and return. Deposits became mandatory, even for people she knew. Eli raised an eyebrow when she explained it. "Your dad never made me leave a deposit." "My dad also knew where every wrench in this county was," Eli smiled. "Fair point." Rachel expected resistance, but most renters accepted the rules. Several even seemed relieved to know exactly what they were responsible for. By the end of the month, Rachel had rented the 3 machines 9 times. After repairs, fuel, and parts, the profit was modest. It would not rescue Bennett Farm. It would barely cover a tractor tire. But when she opened the farm account and saw a deposit that had nothing to do with grain, livestock, or borrowing, something in her thinking shifted. The money had arrived during a month when the fields produced nothing. That was what Thomas had understood. The steady side did not need to be large. It needed to keep moving. Rachel printed the month's records and set them beside her father's notebook. Her system looked cleaner, less personal, and probably less generous. It was also easier to understand. The following morning, Eli called asking whether the post driver would ever be available again. Before Rachel answered, another call came in from a farmer she did not know asking about the splitter. By lunch, 4 more people had contacted her after Eli mentioned the rentals at the feed store. Rachel wrote each name on a yellow pad. 6 new requests in a single day. She looked at the 3 machines lined against the barn wall and realized the problem was changing. A week earlier, she had wondered whether anybody still wanted what Thomas had offered. Now she had more people asking than her small setup could handle. Rachel had expected spring to bring relief. Instead, rain settled over Mason Ridge and seemed unwilling to leave. Fields stayed too wet to work, planting dates slipped, and every delay turned into another calculation at the kitchen table. Seed was already paid for. Fuel prices had risen again. The equipment rentals continued, but the small income disappeared quickly into ordinary farm expenses. Then the main tractor developed a transmission problem. Rachel heard the grinding noise halfway across the south field and shut it down before the damage became worse. The repair estimate arrived the next morning. She read the number twice, then set the paper down. Nearly everything she had earned from the equipment arrangement would vanish into one repair. "Of course," she said to the empty kitchen. The farm did not care that she had found a new source of income. It simply found another place to spend it. Mark arrived that afternoon after June mentioned the tractor. He stood beside the machine while the mechanic loaded it for transport. "How bad enough? And you're paying for it?" "How?" "I have money set aside. From the rentals." Rachel nodded. Mark looked toward the fields. That little side business isn't saving this, it's helping, until something else breaks. He pulled a folded sheet from his jacket. There's interest in the east acreage. Good ground. Sell part of it now and you could clear enough debt to stop living from crisis to crisis. Rachel did not take the paper. I'm not selling another piece. You already sold one. The shed kept the bank off me. And now the tractor is eating what you made afterward. His words were harsh, but the numbers behind them were real. Later, June found Rachel at the kitchen table staring at the contact information Mark had left behind. You don't have to prove anything to him, June said. This isn't about Mark. Then what is it about? Rachel looked toward the rain-dark fields. Knowing when I'm saving the farm and when I'm just refusing to admit I can't, June sat across from her. Your father made bad years look ordinary because he'd lived through so many of them. That doesn't mean he always knew the right answer. Rachel almost called the realtor that evening. She entered the number into her phone, then stopped before pressing call. The next morning, Caleb contacted her about the post driver. It needed a hydraulic fitting replaced before Eli could use it, and Caleb offered space in the old tractor shed because his tools were already there. Walking back into the building felt stranger than Rachel expected. Caleb had stacked feed pallets along one wall, but the workbench remained where Thomas had left it. The 17 numbered hooks were still mounted behind the cabinet. Rachel avoided looking at them. Together, she and Caleb removed the damaged fitting. You've been busy, he said. Busy losing money in more creative ways. That bad tractor repair wiped out most of what I made from rentals. Caleb tightened a vise. That's what repair money is for. It was supposed to become breathing room. Sometimes breathing room means paying the bill that would have put you under. Rachel glanced around the shed. For weeks, she had imagined that if she could somehow own this building again, she would feel as though the farm had stopped shrinking. Standing inside it now, she realized how backward that was. Thomas's system had not worked because of these walls. It worked because he used idle equipment, shared costs, knew what neighbors needed, and kept money moving when crops did not. The shed had been useful. It had never been the source. Rachel finished replacing the fitting and tested the post driver outside. The machine ran cleanly. Caleb wiped his hands on a rag. You thinking about buying this place back someday? The question embarrassed her because the answer had been yes from the moment she discovered what Thomas had done. I thought about it. I'm not looking to sell. Good. Rachel surprised herself with the relief in her voice. Because I shouldn't buy it. Caleb studied her. You sure? Rachel looked toward Bennett Farm beyond the fence line. The tractor still needed repair. Planting was already late. Buying back the shed would require money she did not have or debt she did not need. If I spend anything extra right now, it goes into getting the tractor running and seed in the ground. That afternoon, she called the repair shop and authorized the work. Then she deleted the realtor's number without calling. The decision did not make the farm healthier overnight. It did not stop the rain. But it changed something in Rachel. For the first time since selling the shed, she stopped treating the building as the piece she had to recover before she could believe she was succeeding. Thomas had built a system there. Rachel could build one somewhere else. And when she transferred the repair payment from the equipment account to the tractor bill, she understood that choosing the farm over the shed was not another loss. It was the first decision that felt entirely like her own. Rachel stopped trying to recreate Thomas's arrangement exactly. The decision began with a spreadsheet at the kitchen table. She listed every rental from the previous months, then removed the machines that required too much maintenance or sat unused. The tiller, log splitter, utility trailer, and post driver stayed on the list. Several less requested items did not. Thomas had kept equipment because somebody might need it someday. Rachel could not afford someday. She needed machines that earned enough to pay for their own repairs. At the top of a clean page, she typed a name: Bennett Equipment Share and Repair. Seeing it made the operation feel more serious than the corner of the machine barn where everything was stored. She created separate records for rental income, parts, repairs, and maintenance. Every customer received clear pickup and return times. Deposits were recorded instead of exchanged casually. Equipment was inspected before leaving and again when returned. Caleb handled repairs Rachel could not safely perform herself and charged her for his time. "Your dad would have traded me 3 favors and a pie from June," he said while replacing a bearing on the tiller. "That's why I can't tell what anything actually cost him." Caleb smiled. "You sound like an accountant. I sound like someone with a loan payment." Eli became her best source of word-of-mouth business. He never exaggerated what Rachel offered. He simply told other small farmers that Bennett had equipment available without requiring them to buy machines they might use twice a year. Demand grew steadily rather than dramatically. That suited Rachel. When someone suggested she purchase another trailer on credit, she refused. "If the one I have stays booked, I'll reconsider after it pays for itself." The old Rachel might have heard caution as fear. Now she heard survival. June began helping almost accidentally. One morning, Rachel returned from the field and found 3 messages written in her mother's careful handwriting. People kept calling. June said, "I told them I wasn't your secretary." Rachel looked at the detailed names, phone numbers, requested equipment, and dates. "You're an excellent secretary. Don't get comfortable." A week later, June was answering calls for 2 hours every Tuesday and Thursday. Rachel showed her the rental calendar. June learned it faster than Rachel expected. Their conversations began shifting away from whether the farm could survive toward what needed doing next. One afternoon, June looked at a full week of reservations and said, "Your father would have liked seeing this." Rachel expected the comment to make her feel compared with Thomas. Instead, she smiled. "He would hate my deposit policy." "Absolutely." Their laughter lasted until another pickup entered the yard. The first serious test of Rachel's new rules came when a longtime acquaintance returned the log splitter with a bent hydraulic guard. He insisted it had happened during ordinary use and expected Rachel to absorb the repair. Under Thomas's system, she suspected her father would have done exactly that, especially if the customer promised to help with fencing later. Rachel inspected the photographs taken before the rental. The guard had been straight. "I'm not charging you for the whole repair," she said. "The part had some age on it, but the damage happened while you had it, so I'm keeping part of the deposit." The man frowned. Thomas never treated people like contracts. The comparison stung. "I'm not Dad." I noticed. Rachel nearly gave the deposit back just to end the conversation. Then she thought about the tractor repair and every small expense that had quietly eaten through the farm account. "I'll show you the repair invoice. I'm splitting the cost fairly. That's the best I can do." He left unhappy. Rachel spent the rest of the afternoon wondering whether she had lost a customer and damaged Thomas's reputation along with him. Caleb heard about it the next day. "You did the right thing. Dad would have handled it differently. Thomas could fix half that equipment himself and accepted favors as currency. You're running different numbers." Rachel knew that was true. She also knew accepting it meant letting Thomas's methods belong to Thomas instead of treating them as rules she had failed to follow. Summer progressed. The equipment account grew slowly. Some weeks brought repairs that erased most of the income. Other weeks, every machine returned on time and nothing broke. Rachel resisted spending the good weeks as though they guaranteed another. At the end of each month, she transferred only what the farm needed and left the rest untouched. 6 months after she had first placed 3 machines in the corner of the barn, Rachel sat down with June and reconciled the account. All outstanding repair bills were paid, rental deposits balanced. The farm had received several useful transfers. Money still remained. "What are you going to do with it?" June asked. Rachel opened a new savings account and typed the label carefully. Farm Emergency Reserve. She transferred the surplus. The balance was not large enough to rescue Bennett Farm from every disaster. It did not need to be. For the first time since Thomas died, Rachel had money set aside that was not already promised to a lender. A repair shop, seed, fuel, or another overdue necessity. She stared at the confirmation screen. Thomas's steady side had helped his farm survive uncertainty. Rachel had finally built her own version. And for the first time it had created something Bennett Farm had not possessed in months. A cushion. Before the next problem arrived. Near the end of summer, Mark arrived at Bennett Farm carrying an envelope thick enough that Rachel knew it did not contain another suggestion. She was finishing a rental inspection on the utility trailer when he held it out. "You should read this before you say no." "That sounds promising." "It's an offer for the farm." Rachel stopped writing. "The whole farm? The house and main acreage?" "They're serious." Inside the envelope was a purchase proposal with a number larger than Rachel had ever seen attached to anything she owned. It would clear the remaining farm debt and leave her with enough money to start over comfortably. Months earlier, the offer might have felt like rescue. Now it felt more complicated. Mark watched her face. "This is what I've been trying to tell you. You can get out before another bad season puts you back where you started. I'm not where I started. You're renting log splitters and hoping the weather cooperates. And paying bills for now." Rachel folded the proposal. "I'll look at it." Mark seemed surprised she had not immediately refused. That evening, June sat with Rachel at the kitchen table while she spread out the farm records. "Mark thinks I should take it," Rachel said. "I know. What do you think?" June considered the question. "I think you should decide from these." She tapped the papers. "Not because your father loved this place, not because Mark thinks you can't handle it, and not because you need to prove him wrong." Rachel looked at her mother. Earlier in the year, June had quietly suggested selling before the bank reduced Rachel's choices. Now she was not telling her to stay either. So just numbers first, then decide what kind of life you want with them. Rachel spent 2 nights doing what she had once avoided because she feared the answer. She calculated crop income, livestock expenses, debt payments, projected yield, machinery repairs, and the money generated by Bennett Equipment Share and Repair. The farm was not suddenly prosperous. One major breakdown could still hurt. A disastrous harvest would still matter, but the operating picture had changed. The equipment business supplied cash during months when the fields produced nothing. The emergency reserve remained untouched. Bills were current. Debt was moving down rather than climbing. Most importantly, Bennett Farm was no longer losing cash every month simply by continuing to exist. Rachel checked the totals again. Then a third time. The answer remained the same. She called Mark the next morning. "I'm turning down the offer." Silence followed. "You cannot be serious." "I am, Rachel. That is a good price." "I know. Then what exactly are you waiting for? Another wet spring? Another transmission?" "I'm not waiting for anything. You're gambling that one decent stretch means you fixed the farm?" Rachel looked through the kitchen window toward the fields. "No. For the first time, I'm not gambling everything on one harvest. That equipment thing isn't enough to carry this place." "It doesn't have to carry it. It has to support it." Mark's voice hardened. "Dad spent his whole life trying to make this farm work. And you think a spreadsheet suddenly makes you smarter? No. Dad was already doing part of this. I just made it work differently." And when it fails, then I look at the numbers again. You'll wish you took this offer. Rachel felt the old urge to defend herself until Mark admitted she belonged here. Instead, she said, "Maybe, but if that day comes, I'll make that decision then." Mark ended the call angry. Rachel expected to feel victorious. She did not. Turning down enough money to erase nearly every financial worry was frightening. But fear no longer automatically meant she was making the wrong choice. 2 days later, Caleb stopped by to return a repaired hydraulic cylinder. Rachel paid his invoice from the equipment account and helped unload it. "Heard you turned down an offer," Caleb said. Rachel gave him a look. "Does everyone in Mason Ridge know?" "Probably everyone except the people pretending not to. Mark thinks I've lost my mind." Caleb shrugged. "Have you? The numbers say no." "Better answer than most farmers have." They cricked Im into the cylinder into the machine barn. Before leaving, Caleb hesitated beside his truck. "Speaking of property, I might build a new storage shed closer to my house." Rachel glanced toward the north side of the farm. The old tractor shed was partly visible beyond the boundary of the parcel she had sold him. "What happens to Dad's shed?" "If I build, I won't need both." Something tightened in Rachel's chest. For months, she had trained herself to stop treating that building as proof of whether she had succeeded. Now Caleb was casually suggesting it might become available again. "You'd sell it?" "Probably. Shed and the parcel together, same as I bought them." Rachel immediately thought of the emergency reserve, the operating loan, seed costs, repairs. She refused to let emotion answer before arithmetic. "Do you know what you'd want for it?" Caleb named a figure based on what he had paid and the work he had put into the property. It was fair. It was also more cash than Rachel could safely spend. Caleb watched her expression. "I'm not offering it today. Just telling you before I make plans." Rachel nodded. But after he drove away, she remained beside the barn. Months ago, she had been forced to sell the tractor shed because Bennett Farm could not afford to keep everything. Now the farm was stable enough that the same building might come within reach again. Rachel looked toward the old corrugated roof and repeated Caleb's price silently. This time, before wanting the shed, she needed to know whether she could truly afford to bring it home. Caleb gave Rachel a written price for the tractor shed and its parcel 3 days later. She carried the paper home, placed it beside her farm accounts, and spent the evening trying to make the purchase work. Technically, she could. The emergency reserve covered a large portion. A short-term loan could cover the rest. She also had money allocated for seed and early season expenses that would sit untouched for several months. Put everything together, and the shed could belong to her again almost immediately. Rachel stared at the total and felt the same pull she had felt since Caleb mentioned selling. She imagined walking into the building with her own key. She imagined Mark hearing that she had bought back the first piece of Bennett Farm he predicted she would lose. Most of all, she imagined reversing the signature that had felt like an admission of failure. Then she looked at the column labeled Farm Emergency Reserve. 6 months of careful discipline would disappear in one transaction. The next equipment failure would go on to credit. The next difficult planting season would leave her scrambling again. Rachel closed the spreadsheet. The following morning, she met Caleb beside the old shed. "The price is fair," she said, "but I can't buy it." Caleb leaned against his pickup. "Can't or don't want to?" "I want to." "Then I'm missing something. I can get the money. I just can't spend it responsibly." She explained the reserve, the seed money, and the additional borrowing. Caleb listened without interrupting. "A year ago, I would have called having enough money in the accounts the same thing as being able to afford it," Rachel said. "Now, I know some money already has a job." Caleb nodded. "I'm not in a rush. If I build the new shed, this one won't disappear overnight." Rachel appreciated that. But she refused to ask him to hold it indefinitely. If somebody makes you a good offer, "Take it." Saying that hurt more than she expected. She went inside once before leaving. The 17 numbered hooks still hung on the rear wall. Caleb had never removed them. Rachel touched the hook marked 4 and remembered finding Thomas's notebook, then the bank record showing how his small equipment income had protected the farm. She had once believed getting this building back would prove the sale had only been temporary. Now she understood that buying it at the wrong time could recreate the same financial weakness that forced her to sell it. She walked out without making an offer. Mark learned about Caleb's plans within a week. He brought it up when he stopped at June's house while Rachel was there. "I hear your old shed is available." "Maybe." "You buying it back?" "Not now." Mark smiled faintly. "So even your big comeback can't buy back the building you sold months earlier." The remark would have followed Rachel for days. She would have explained the accounts, defended the equipment operation, or pointed out that she had rejected an offer for the entire farm. This time she simply looked at him. "Not yet." Mark waited, apparently expecting more. Rachel returned to the invoices in front of her. June said nothing until he left. Then she asked, "You really could buy it?" "If I emptied the emergency reserve, used money meant for seed, and borrowed the rest?" "So you can't," Rachel smiled. "Exactly." Summer faded into early autumn. The equipment operation remained busy. The post driver went out repeatedly as farmers repaired fences before winter. The trailer stayed booked through harvest preparation, while the splitter began receiving reservations as temperatures dropped. Rachel continued separating operating income from repair money. She did not expand simply because demand existed at the same time. The fields looked better than they had during the wet spring. The delayed planting had worried her for months, but the crop recovered enough that early yield estimates came in above her cautious projections. Not exceptional, just better than she had allowed herself to hope. Rachel refused to count harvest money before grain was sold. Instead, she created another savings category in the equipment account. She stared at the blank label for several seconds before typing "Shed Buyback." The first transfer was small. So was the second. Each came only after maintenance costs, farm needs, and the emergency reserve were protected. Weeks passed. Rental income accumulated. Rachel added another portion after a particularly busy stretch. One evening, June sat beside her while she reconciled the account. "How close are you?" "Closer." That sounds suspiciously vague. Rachel turned the laptop so her mother could see. June studied the figures and smiled. "Your father would have started negotiating already. God could rebuild a gearbox with scrap metal and stubbornness. I need cash." Rachel entered the latest transfer and watched the balance update. For a moment, she thought she had miscalculated. She checked Caleb's written price, then the account again. The buyback fund had crossed half the amount required to purchase the shed and parcel. Rachel leaned back. She still did not own the building. Caleb could still sell it elsewhere. A poor harvest or expensive repair could slow everything down. But for the first time, buying the shed back no longer required draining the farm to satisfy her pride. More than half the price now existed in money Bennett Farm had earned after surviving the very sale her family had mocked. A year after Rachel signed away the tractor shed, she sat at the same kitchen table with a very different set of numbers in front of her. The harvest had been good, though nowhere near the kind farmers talked about for years afterward. The delayed spring had reduced some yields, but the later weather had been kind enough to recover much of what Rachel feared losing. Grain sales covered their share of the farm expenses. Bennett Equipment's share and repair had done something equally important. It had kept cash coming in between those larger payments. Rachel reconciled every account before allowing herself to think about Caleb's shed. The operating loan payment had been made on time. Repair invoices were current. Money for seed and early season costs remained where it belonged. Most importantly, The farm emergency reserve was still intact. Rachel opened the shed buyback account last. The balance had finally reached Caleb's price. She stared at it for several seconds. There had been no sudden windfall, no miraculous crop. The money represented dozens of ordinary transactions, 2 days with the tiller, 3 with the trailer, a post-driver rental, a repair job, another splitter reservation. Small amounts that had accumulated because Rachel had stopped dismissing small amounts as insignificant. June came into the kitchen carrying groceries and noticed the spreadsheet. "You have the look." "What look? The one your father had before spending money?" Rachel turned the laptop toward her. June studied the balance. "You have enough, exactly enough, in the buyback fund. Without the reserve, without touching it, seed already covered. Borrowing." Rachel shook her head. June smiled. "Then I suppose you'd better call Caleb." Rachel did, but she still asked him whether the price they had discussed remained valid. "It does," Caleb said. "You sure you want it now?" The question made Rachel pause. A year earlier, she would have answered before he finished speaking. "Yes, because you miss it?" "That too." Rachel looked at the account balances, but mostly because the farm can afford it. They met 2 days later. Caleb had completed his newer storage building and no longer needed the old shed. The transaction was uncomplicated compared with the first sale, yet signing the papers affected Rachel more. The first time, she had watched her name disappear from the property while wondering whether Mark was right about what would go next. Now she signed as buyer. When the payment cleared, the emergency reserve remained untouched. No lender had been called. No seed money had moved. Caleb handed her the keys. Back where they started. Rachel closed her hand around them. "Not quite." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "I'm different." He smiled. "Fair enough." Rachel drove directly to the bank afterward, not because she needed financing, but because she wanted to confirm the farm accounts after the purchase. The operating loan remained current. For the first time since Thomas died, she could look at the debt without feeling as though one bad week would decide everything. Bennett Farm was not rich. It was simply functioning. That distinction had become enough. On the way home, Rachel stopped beside the tractor shed. She did not go inside yet. Instead, she stood by the parcel boundary and looked across toward the fields. She had imagined this moment so many times that she expected triumph. What she felt was quieter. The shed had not rescued the farm by returning. The farm had earned the ability to bring it back. Later that afternoon, Mark drove past and noticed Caleb removing the last of his stored materials. He turned around and pulled into the yard. "Caleb moving out?" "Yes." "He sell it?" Rachel nodded. Mark looked toward the shed, then back at her. "To who?" Rachel held up the keys. His expression changed. "You bought it?" "This morning." "You took out another loan for a shed?" "No." "Then you used the emergency money?" "No." Mark frowned. "Where did it come from?" "The equipment business." He stared at her long enough that she could see him trying to reconcile the answer with everything he had said over the past year. All of it. The buyback fund covered the purchase. And the farm bills paid. Operating loan, current. Mark glanced toward the fields. "You got lucky with the harvest." It helped. Rachel did not need to argue away the truth. So did 12 months of equipment income. Mark gave a short nod. Neither apology nor congratulations. "I still think selling the shed in the first place was a warning." Rachel looked at the keys in her hand. "It was..." "About what?" "That I couldn't keep running the farm the same way and expect it to survive." Mark had no quick answer to that. After he left, Rachel walked to the shed door. A faded sold notice from the property transaction was still attached near the entrance. She removed it and folded it once before putting it in her jacket pocket. Then she unlocked the door. The familiar smell of metal, dust, and old grease met her. Across the back wall, partly hidden behind the wooden cabinet, the 17 numbered hooks remained exactly where Thomas had left them. Rachel took the newly recorded deed from the folder under her arm and held it for a moment. A year ago, losing this building had felt like the beginning of losing Bennett Farm piece by piece. Now she owned it again, without selling another acre, draining the reserve, or borrowing the money. Yet standing there, Rachel understood something Mark could not see from the road. Buying back the tractor shed was not the final victory. What mattered was what Bennett Farm had learned to become in order to earn it back. Rachel returned to the tractor shed early the next morning with the new keys in her pocket. She unlocked the door and stood inside without turning on the lights. Morning entered through the dusty windows. Catching the old workbench and the numbered hooks behind the wooden cabinet, 17 hooks. She had once looked at them and wondered what Thomas had been hiding. Now they seemed less like a mystery than a record of how he had survived. Rachel moved the cabinet aside but did not remove the board. Instead, she mounted a new sign beside it: Bennett Equipment Share and Repair. The operation moved gradually from the machine barn back into the shed. Rachel installed shelves for parts, marked inspection areas, and created separate spaces for equipment awaiting repair and machines ready for rental. The old hooks remained on the wall, but beneath them she installed a new keyboard with labels that matched her own records. She also kept the financial structure that had made buying the building possible. Rental income went into its own account. Maintenance money stayed reserved for maintenance. A repair fund covered breakdowns before they became emergencies. Rachel refused to let the shed become dependent on her remembering every agreement the way Thomas had. June noticed the difference the first week she helped answer calls there. Your father could tell you where every machine was without writing anything down, and nobody else could. June smiled. He would argue with that. He's welcome to. June ran her finger along Thomas's old numbered hooks. This place feels like him. Rachel looked at the new schedules clipped beneath them. It feels like both of us now. The work settled into ordinary rhythms. Eli returned the post driver one afternoon. Muddy but undamaged, Rachel checked it against the inspection sheet while another customer waited for the log splitter. June recorded a reservation at the desk. Caleb arrived carrying a repaired hydraulic component and set it on the workbench. Nobody stopped to admire the fact that Rachel owned the shed again. They simply used it. That pleased her more than she expected. Mark came by near the end of the week. He stood inside the doorway looking from Thomas's hooks to Rachel's sign. You really bought it back? You saw the keys. I thought maybe you were making a point. Rachel closed the equipment ledger. I was buying a shed. With money from this, the farm did. Mark gave her a questioning look. The equipment operation earned the buyback money. I didn't borrow it. I didn't touch the emergency reserve. He walked farther inside. I said the shed would be the first thing to go. I said the fields would follow. Rachel glanced through the open door toward the Bennett acreage. They didn't. Mark rubbed a hand over the edge of the workbench. I thought you were going to fail. The admission was quieter than his earlier warnings. Rachel could have reminded him of every joke and every prediction. Instead, she said, For a while, I thought so too. You still could have taken that offer for the whole place. I know. Would have been easier. Probably. Mark nodded. Dad never did know how to choose easy. Neither do you, apparently. It was not an apology, and Rachel did not need to turn it into one. Mark had believed selling was the rational choice. Rachel had finally learned that keeping the farm did not require proving him foolish. When he left, the distance between them had not vanished. But it no longer felt like something Rachel needed to win. That evening, she reviewed the farm accounts. The emergency reserve remained intact. The operating loan was current. The shed had its own repair money. For the first time, Rachel began setting limits on herself as carefully as she set limits on the finances. She stopped answering routine rental calls late at night. June handled scheduled phone hours twice a week. Caleb took specialized repair work instead of Rachel attempting every job herself. When demand exceeded the equipment available, Rachel sometimes said no rather than buying another machine on credit. Bennett Farm had survived Thomas because Rachel stopped trying to become Thomas a few days later. She found June standing beneath the old hooks while waiting for a customer. "I used to think keeping the farm meant keeping everything exactly where Dad left it," Rachel said. June looked around the shed. "Your father changed things constantly. He just complained while doing it," Rachel laughed. "That sounds more accurate." June touched her arm. "You didn't save his farm." Rachel looked at her. "No. You made yours work." The words stayed with Rachel through the afternoon. Eli arrived to collect the trailer. Someone else called about the tiller. Caleb returned for a wrench he had forgotten. Nothing important happened. And that was exactly what Rachel had wanted for months. A farm where ordinary days no longer felt one bill away from disaster. Near sunset, she finished the last inspection and closed the ledger. The shed became quiet. Rachel walked to the back wall and studied the 2 generations of keys. Thomas's 17 numbered hooks remained above, several empty. Their painted numbers faded with age. Beneath them hung Rachel's keys, clearly labeled and matched to records anyone could understand. For months, she had believed buying back the shed would erase the humiliation of selling it. It did not. She could still remember signing the first deed, Mark laughing, June wondering whether the entire farm should be sold, and the sick feeling of watching one piece of Bennett property leave her hands. But Rachel no longer wanted to erase that day. Selling the shed had paid the obligation that needed paying. If pride had made her keep it, the bank might eventually have forced a far worse decision. Losing one piece had bought her time. Finding Thomas's notebook had shown her what that time could become. Thomas had not left her a secret fortune or a perfect business waiting to be reopened. He had left evidence that a small farm survived by finding income wherever useful work existed. Rachel had taken that lesson, changed the parts that no longer worked, and built something she could actually manage. She turned off the lights and stepped outside. Across the property, the Bennett fields darkened beneath the evening sky. They still belonged to the family, not because Rachel had refused to lose anything, but because she had learned that protecting a farm sometimes meant letting one part go before it pulled everything else down. She locked the shed, then looked once through the window at the old hooks and her new keyboard beneath them. Her family had mocked her when she sold the first piece of the farm. A year later, she had bought that same piece back not with inheritance, pride, borrowed money, or a miraculous harvest, but with income the farm had learned to earn for itself. Rachel finally understood what Thomas's steady side had been teaching her all along. She hadn't saved the farm by refusing to let anything go. She saved it by learning what could come back